think I'm wired, although it's very dangerous for a Sicilian to wear something like this. What I thought I would do is to just talk a few minutes about poetry in general, because this is not just a reading, it's a forum for poetry, for literature, for the literary arts. And I think that although in education, in our society, we spend a lot of time talking about particular poets and things like this, we don't always stop and just talk about poetry from a broader perspective as a human art. And what I'd like to do is just talk a few minutes about that, about what poetry is and why it has human importance. Now, poetry is one of the basic, ancient, and I would even say primal human arts. It's one of those arts like song or dance that you really make with your body. Poetry existed in every culture. Am I getting feedback on this? Okay, I'm just hearing it myself. One of these arts, as I said, it comes out of the human body, that you don't need anything but what God gave you. And poetry exists in every culture that we know before writing exists. And in fact, if you look at somebody like Homer, poetry in some sense is perfected, it's developed, it's an extraordinarily sophisticated art before writing existed. Now, what is poetry? Now, you have to put yourself back in the mindset, the experience of a tribal culture. I mean, you could go back even to, Raquel Welch in 1 million BC, minus the dinosaurs. It's a culture without amenities, a culture that's always in danger, a culture in which tribal groups and clans are really clinging together for their survival. And what poetry is in that culture, and I think in a different sort of way is in our own culture, and I'll paraphrase what Robert Frost said, is a way of remembering what it would impoverish us to forget. Poetry is, to use a Silicon Valley term, a kind of a memory technology. You don't have books, and those things that it is important for your society, your tribe, your family to remember, both for its physical survival and its spiritual survival, you put in poems. And so, if you look in Greek mythology, who is the mother of the 9 muses? I told somebody this answer in class. Does anybody know? The goddess memory, Mnemosyne. Memory is the mother of the muses. Memory is the mother of poetry. And it's, in a sense, it's a way of taking those things and finding a way of putting them in words so that they are remembered, so that they are present in a culture. So in a tribal culture, the poet stands at the very center of society, preserving those things which it is essential for the society to know, to understand who we are, where we have come from, where we are going. Now, with each change in technology, with each change in society, the poet's role has changed a little bit. But I still think that in a basic sense, poetry is a special way of speaking that invites and rewards a special way of listening. What poetry does, in effect, because you have to go back all the way into society when what we think of today as song, dance, poetry, religion, magic were the same thing. Poetry creates a spell. The poet casts a spell. And I think in physiological terms, what the poet does is to try to create a slight hypnotic trance. Now, when I say cast a spell, it seems, well, is the poet going to trick you? And I guess a bad poet, that's the intent of it, to a certain degree, the effect of a bad poem. But think of it in a positive sense. What a poet is trying to do, what great poetry is trying to do, is to cast a spell on you, which allows you to access those parts of your humanity, which every day encourages you to shut off. So what a great poem does, in a sense, is remind you who you are in the completeness of your humanity. And that means that a poem, and we forget this in universities where we tend to talk about poetry in very analytical language, poetry is only fractionally intellectual. A poem speaks to you holistically, simultaneously addressing your mind, your heart, your physical senses, your memory. In some ways, I think that the older you are, the more experience you have, the more you can bring to a poem, because the more of your life it is. And so what a poem tries to do is, in a sense, is to create a kind of palace or a church or a house or a valley or a glade in the air. in which the poet has one entrance, but every listener, in a sense, can find their own entrance. And that's why there's no one interpretation for any one poem. Now, before I get too remote, let me just give you a poem or two. This is a very short poem by Robert Bridges, who was poet laureate around the turn of the century. It's just a triolet. It's only 8 lines long, just 2 rhymes. When first we met, we did not guess that love would prove so hard a master of more than common friendliness when first we met. Who could foretell that sore distress, this irretrievable disaster? When first we met, we did not guess that love would prove so hard a master. Now, I'm not sure if any of you can relate to that poem. I hope that some of you can, but I suspect that what happens there, if the spell worked, if you felt yourself drawn into that poem, what you did is you fleshed it out with experiences from your own life. You know, and God knows, I think all of us have had at least one irretrievable disaster of the heart. I mean, there's no way to grow up without having that happen. And that's, you know, and that's what a poem does. I was driving down here and I was trying to think of a poem that took place in May, because I thought it would be nice to celebrate this month. And if you'll forgive me, this is a poem I don't really know. I reconstructed from my memory. But I want to just talk about it, and then I'll go into my own poems. So you'll be a little bit stepped down in quality, alas. This is an early sonnet by Shakespeare. I think it's number 18 or thereabouts in his sonnets. And it goes, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease has all too short a date. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of the fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, for in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men have breath and eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." And what's interesting about that poem is I think that you can see that already the same kinds of things that I'm talking about. There's this deep emotion of something that seems to Shakespeare of incredible value, the beauty of this loved one. And also built with that the notion that we're all mortal, that we're living in time, and time will not be ours forever. He at length our joys shall sever. Spend then not his gifts in vain. Suns that set may rise again, but when once we lose our light, 'tis with us perpetual night. And that sense, now if we were eternal, if we were gods, we would have no need of poetry. But poetry is that basic, human sort of spiritual mechanism in the sense of preserving those things which we think are of inestimable value. And the poets boast, and I guess it's easy to boast this because if you fail to boast, nobody's around to catch you. So as long as men have breath and eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee, which is in a sense to try to lodge a few perceptions of your own against time, to quote Ovid, devourer of all things. And so I think that that we think about that. Poetry is, in a sense, this basic human art, because as long as we use speech to communicate, not just with one another, but with ourselves, the very concepts that we describe ourselves, the very words that we pray to God, I think that poetry is always going to be valuable to us, because it remains the art of refining and, in some ways, perpetuating the basic means, of our articulation of our own existence in time. Having spoken in such lofty terms, we're now going to take a great pathetic plunge into my own work. And what I thought I would do is read you a dozen poems. And what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to read one of them twice, so I hope you'll indulge me. but it's very short. And this story has this poem has a story behind it. A few years ago, National Public Radio asked me to write a poem for New Year's Day. And so I wrote this elegant 32-line poem about the idea of New Year's. And after it was recorded and broadcast, I decided I wanted to revise it, and before I published it. And so it went from 32 lines to 28, from 28 to 24, to 20, to 18, to 16. It never stopped at the sonnet. It went directly to 12, to 10, and I thought it was almost done, but it seemed too long, so I took it down to 8. And then I saw things had to go. And so I finally finished it. It's 6 lines long. It no longer has anything whatsoever to do with New Year's. But instead, it's about how much of the lives we lead are private, known only to ourselves. And the poem is called Unsaid. So much of what we live goes on inside. The diaries of grief, the tongue-tied aches of unacknowledged love are no less real for having passed unsaid. What we conceal is always more than what we dare confide. Think of the letters that we write our dead. Now, for me as an artist, poems tend to happen basically in one of two ways, and it's a very different experience, and it's hard to describe. I think most poets understand this. Usually what a poem begins as is a very vague emotional state. I mean, when I get an inspiration for a poem, I feel it physically. There's certain parts of my body that just tingle, and I feel this kind of rush. And usually what I write down are images, unconnected lines, and it's usually a kind of something obsessive image or obsessive figure of speech. And the process for me of writing the poem is to discover what the poem is about. And I often don't know what the poems are about until they're done or almost done. And sometimes I don't know what they're about really until years later, when I say, oh, it's so obvious. I was writing about this problem that I didn't want to admit to myself. But there's another kind of poem, and that's a poem that really happens, where life gives you an experience that has a kind of shape and intensity. And there what you're trying to do is to describe it in words in a way which is somehow true to the feeling of the experience. And this is a poem that really happened. Shortly after my wife and I got married, we came home to our apartment, and there was a bouquet of flowers waiting. And it was only signed with a first name. And unfortunately, it was a first name like Dana, a name of ambiguous gender. And I claimed I didn't know anybody with this name, and my wife claimed that she didn't know anybody with this name would have sent her flowers. So we took the bouquet in, which was a huge bouquet. We put it on the kitchen table, and it simply sat there. And so about a week or two later, I wrote a poem called Thanks for Remembering Us. The flowers, sent here by mistake, signed with a name that no one knew, are turning bad. What shall we do? Our neighbor says they're not for her, and no one has a birthday near. We should thank someone for the blunder. Is one of us having an affair? At first we laugh, and then we wonder. The iris was the first to die, enshrouded in its sickly, sweet, and lingering perfume. The roses fell one petal at a time, and now the ferns are turning dry. The room smells like a funeral, but there they sit, too much at home, accusing us of some small crime, like love forgotten. And we can't throw out a gift we've never owned. I guess I wasn't planning on reading it, but I thought, since John mentioned it, this is a poem that meant a lot to me. This is the first poem I ever had in the New Yorker. It's still actually my most anthologized and most translated poem. When I was writing it, I thought of it as a poem that maybe nobody outside of California would understand. But it has a great appeal, apparently, for people in dry countries, because it's been translated into a lot of dry languages. This is called California Hills in August. And it's one elaborately vast and overcomplicated sentence. But when it was accepted in the New Yorker, Howard Moss, the poetry editor, judiciously placed a period at the end of each stanza. And it acquired a simplicity and elegance, you know, that was not in the original, but I'm willing to take credit for. And the first part of the poem is just the way somebody from somewhere else, like an Easterner, would see California, and at the very end, the way a native sees it. And in this occasion, when I heard some guy in the office I worked in New York, he'd been out to California, and they said, well, what was it like? He says, oh, it wasn't pretty like Vermont, it was all dry. And that got my rankles up. And a few weeks later, I wrote this poem called California Hills in August. I can imagine someone who found these fields unbearable, who climbed the hillside in the heat, cursing the dust, cracking the brittle weeds underfoot, wishing a few more trees for shade. An Easterner especially, who would scorn the meagerness of summer, the dry, twisted shape of black elm, scrub oak, and chaparral, a landscape August had already drained of green. One who would hurry over the clinging thistle, foxtail, golden poppy, knowing everything was just a weed, unable to conceive that these trees and sparse brown bushes were alive, and hate the bright stillness of the noon, without wind, without motion, the only other living thing, a hawk, hungry for prey, suspended in the blinding, sunlit blue. And yet, how gentle it seems to someone raised in a landscape short of rain, the skyline of a hill, broken by no more trees than one can count, the grass, the empty sky, the wish for water. Now I took a poem that, once again, I had no idea what it was about when I first wrote it, and I don't have much better idea today. But I think it's an important thing that at every point in a poetry reading, somebody read a poem that you don't like and don't understand. I think that reminds us what poetry should be. Now, this is a poem that takes place in Paris between the end of the First World War and the middle of the Second World War, when the Germans are occupying Paris. And all of the characters that are in it are members of the Surrealist movement. The fellow who has the most lines is André Breton, who is sort of the ringleader of Surrealism, but also Apollinaire, who was the godfather of Surrealism, Picasso, who wasn't a Surrealist but hung around with Surrealists, Dali, whom I'm sure you all know. You probably don't know Raymond Roussel, although there's just been a big biography published of him. And he was a French millionaire who became a Surrealist, and he eventually squandered his entire fortune putting on Surrealist pageants, and finally when he was bankrupt he killed himself. Hugo Ball was one of the founders of Dada, and who denounced it on his deathbed after converting to Catholicism. And then there's Paul Éluard, really the prototypical Surrealist. And I used two proverbs of his from the Surrealist book, a little book of Surrealist proverbs he put together. And each stanza ends with one of these proverbs. I want you to hear them ahead of time so you can recognize them as refrains. Well, I think I know them. First one is, there is always a skeleton on the buffet. And the second proverbs are words to live by, which is, I came, I sat down, I went away. And each of the stanzas in that. Now, I have a lot of quotations from the Surrealists. So in order to differentiate between the three levels of language, the proverbs, the quotations, and the narration, I will do the quotations in the voice of Maurice Chevalier. An elegy with Surrealist proverbs as refrain. Poetry must lead somewhere, declared Breton. He carried a rose inside his coat each day to give to a beautiful stranger. Better to die of love than love without regret. And those who loved him soon learned regret. The simplest surreal act is running through the streets with a revolver, firing at random. Old and famous, he seemed démodé. There is always a skeleton on the buffet. Wounded Apollinaire had a small steel plate inserted in his skull. I so loved art, he smiled. I joined the artillery. His friends were asked to wait, while his widow laid a crucifix across his chest. Picasso hated death. The funeral left him so depressed, he painted a self-portrait. It's always other people, remarked Duchamp, who do the dying. I came, I sat down, I went away. Dali dreamed of Hitler as a white-skinned girl, impossibly luminous, lifeless as the moon. Wealthy Roussel taught his poodle to smoke a pipe. When I write, I am surrounded by radiance. My glory is like a great bomb waiting to explode. When his valet refused to slash his wrists, the bankrupt writer took an overdose of pills. There is always a skeleton on the buffet. Breton considered suicide the truest art, though life seemed hardly worth the trouble to discard. The German colonels strolled the Ile de la Cité, some to the Louvre, some to the Place Pigalle. The loneliness of poets has been erased, cried Éluard in praise of Stalin. Burn all the books, said dying Hugo Ball. There is always a skeleton on the buffet. I came, I sat down, I went away. This is a poem, it's an odd poem, and I worked on it for a number of years. And I'm just going to, it's, there was a poet, a very intense, brilliant poet. He was a Southerner, very devout Christian, very proper, and tormentedly and secretly gay. His name is John Finley, and he wrote for the Hudson Review, and I only met him once. I was in New Orleans, and he drove a couple hundred miles, and we spent a whole day with a friend of his named David Middleton, just walking around New Orleans, just talking all day. And I never met him again. And this is a poem called After a Line by Cavafy, Cavafy being the Greek poet, for the poet John Finley, dead of AIDS. Return and take me, distant afternoon. Return and take hold of me, when the blue lake is dry white stone, and the earth reclaims its arch of green. Remember and repeat some confidence we shared, drunk with the promise of our new acquaintance, walking on the shore, arguing ideas as only the young can argue, passionate, naive, nervous with excitement, like two hands touching for the first time. We who were neither lovers nor intimates and never met again. And then finally, one more elegy. This is a poem that once again really happened. It takes place in my parents' orchard up in Sebastopol, California, which is in the Sonoma Valley. Rather dry valley, but every night the fog comes in over the hills. And it refers to a Sicilian custom, which is that when your first child is born, you save the umbilical cord, you wrap it in the roots of a tree, and you plant it. I mean, the symbolism of the custom is so obvious. It's a way of rooting your clan into the earth that feeds it. And usually you plant a fig tree or an olive tree. That's why if you go into an Italian neighborhood, there's almost always olive trees in the backyards, or fig trees. In this case, the tree that's being planted is a California redwood. And so the thing being addressed in the poem, is the redwood tree. And I wrote this poem shortly after the death of my first son, who died at 4 months of sudden infant death syndrome. It's called Planting a Sequoia. All afternoon, my brothers and I have worked in the orchard, digging this hole, laying you into it, carefully packing the soil. Rain blackened the horizon, but cold winds kept it over the Pacific, and the sky above us stayed the dull gray of an old year coming to an end. In Sicily, a father plants a tree to celebrate his first son's birth, an olive or a fig tree, a sign that the earth has one more life to bear. I would have done the same, proudly laying new stock into my father's orchard, a green sapling rising among the twisted apple boughs, a promise of new fruit in other autumns. But today, we kneel in the cold, planting you, our native giant, defying the practical custom of our fathers, wrapping in your roots a lock of hair, a piece of an infant's birth cord, all that remains above earth of a firstborn son, a few stray atoms brought back to the elements. We will give you what we can, our labor and our soil, water drawn from the earth when the skies fail, nights scented with the ocean fog, days softened by the circuit of bees. We plant you in the corner of the grove, bathed in western light, a slender shoot against the sunset. And when our family is no more, all of his unborn brothers dead, every niece and nephew scattered, the house torn down, his mother's beauty ashes in the air, I want you to stand among strangers, all young and ephemeral to you, silently keeping the secret of your birth. Let me change the mood. You can already see just from the poems, by Shakespeare and Bridges that I quoted, and some of my poems, that one of the things that I really like about poetry are the joyful noises you can make unto the Lord, with it when you put words together. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why I've always been drawn to meter and rhyme, and also why I'm unwilling to give up free verse. I mean, it seems to me, I don't know why somebody would want to just do one or the other. It seems to me that you'd want to use all the tools that the language and the literature had provided you with. But I love when that kind of high romantic musical mode. I mean, one of my favorite poets is Tennyson, whom I can quote till the cows come home. And just think of being able to begin a poem. There's a lot of people. Anybody who's standing in the back should really sit. I mean, unless it's your only defense against falling asleep. At which point, I will be happy to allow it. But people shouldn't stand if they don't. There's all kinds of seats down here. And I'm only spitting on the first two rows, as they can attest. People in the third row are entirely dry. But imagine being, Tennyson and being able to start a poem like, "Come into the garden, Maud, for the black bat night has flown. Come into the garden, I am here at the gate alone. And the spice of the woodbine has wafted aloft, and the musk of the rose is blown." And I just love that kind of thing. And the trouble is that 15 of the last 25 years I spent at General Foods selling products like Jell-O, Baker's chocolate, Country Time lemonade. And when you work in that as your daily world, you don't have many occasions to write in the high tragic mode, even when sales are bad. And so I came across a tragic love affair not too long ago, and I felt that had only Lord Tennyson been living at this hour, he would have commemorated it. A friend of mine had a superannuated orange tabby cat named Fred, and she decided to brighten up his twilight years by bringing him home a child bride. Now, this was a very unusual May-December marriage in that the young cat was immensely smitten by Fred, but it was too late, as it turned out in December, for Fred to reciprocate, even though he'd never been neutered. And so every month the young cat would go into heat, but nothing ever happened. And so I wrote her this poem, and it goes like this. It's called Alley Cat Serenade. Come into the garden, Fred, for the neighborhood tabby is gone. Come into the garden, Fred. I have nothing but my flea collar on. And the scent of the catnip is gone to my head. I'll wait by the screen door till dawn. The fireflies court in the sweet gum tree. A nightjar calls from the pine, and she seems to say in her rhapsody, "Oh, mustard brown Fred, be mine." And the full moon sets my whiskers afire, and the fur goes erect on my spine. I hear the frogs in the muddy lake croaking from shore to shore. They've one swift season to soothe their ache. In autumn they sing no more. So ignore me now, and you'll hear my meow as I scratch all night by the door. My kid brother has uncharitably suggested that that's the most autobiographical poem I've ever written. But But the truth is I'm actually much more like Fred. There's another kind of poem, and this is something that, my advice for young poets is always think of yourself as writing poems in collaboration with the language. I mean, it is not just your genius that will produce a good poem. It's the way that you listen to your own language and listen to the poems that have come before you. And think of yourself, in a sense, partnering with language. And this is a poem that just came out. Actually, it started off as a prose piece originally, but it turned into a poem. And it was just playing with the slang for money, and all the slang expressions about money in the American language. And I put it's called Money, and I have as an epigraph one of Wallace Stevens' journal entries, which is, "Money is a kind of poetry." Money, the long green. Cash, stash, rhino, jack, or just plain dough. Chalk it up, fork it over, shell it out. Watch it burn holes through pockets. To be made of it, to have it to burn. What is it? I'm forgetting my own poem here. The list. I should know this poem because my parents gave me every line in this poem. To be made of it, to have it to burn. Greenbacks, megabucks, Ginny Mays, double eagles. It greases the palm, feathers the nest, holds heads above water, makes both ends meet. Money breeds money, gathering interest, compounding daily, always in circulation. Money. You don't know where it's been, but you put it where your mouth is, and it talks. Just four more poems. I'll just do 4 love poems. One of the things that interests me most about poetry now is how much you can cut out and still have a poem. And I really do think that, one of the things I've learned doing anthologies and writing criticism is how short most great poems are. I mean, if you remember the poem as this long, it's usually only this long. And because it has a kind of resonance, a kind of a power of evocation. And so this is really almost like a short story. It's only 8 lines long. And it's sort of, Jackson, there's seats up front. And so, so think of it as a short story where you have the first part of it and you have the end, and I've simply left off the middle. I live in the Sonoma Valley, so I see, all of the, the vineyards there, with basically their migrant labor. And, and then usually in the middle of the vineyards are these great chateaus, these wealthy people that for the most part, like retired lawyers and doctors, for the most part nowadays at least, have built on this. And this is spoken by one of the laborers in some vineyard. It's called Accomplice. In dusty fields, I harvested the vine and sweated at the lever as the grapes were pressed. My aching hands still clutched their vagrant wages, sleeping in the cold barracks of the dispossessed. But now at dawn, beyond the reach of reason, I wake in the chateau between your tangled sheets, my sunburnt arm across your naked shoulder, the mute accomplice of our mutual defeat. I've just finished writing the words to an opera called Nosferatu. It's based on F.W. Murnau's famous silent film, which was a version of the Dracula story, which is also then remade in the 80s by Werner Herzog. And then quite recently, has anybody here seen The Shadow of the Vampire, that film? Yeah, so there's actually a film that's been made about Murnau filming Nosferatu. And it's a very interesting thing to write words for music. I mean, you face kinds of challenges you don't face, when you are working on the page alone. Because first of all, there's somebody who's physically going to be embodying those words. So you have to give that person some sense of who they are, what they want, what's their character. You also have to make it simple enough so the audience embedded in the music can understand it. And thirdly, you have to give a complete shape, but you have to leave room for the composer to come in. So what it is, it's in a sense, it's a kind of, simultaneously a kind of simplification and intensification of poetry at the same time. This is the Vampire's Love Song. If you know the, there's some seats up here, please sit down. If you know the film, he's, in a sense, he's courting the, this woman, but she has to come to him voluntarily, for him to, in a sense, to be his bride. And so, in a sense, he's wooing her now, and he's portraying, in a sense, himself as the darkness that matches, her light, a kind of, in a sense, he completes what she is. Nosferatu's Serenade. Oops. I am the image that darkens your glass, the shadow that falls wherever you pass. I am the dream you cannot forget, the face you remember without having met. I am the truth that cannot be spoken, the midnight vow that cannot be broken. I am the bell that tolls out the hours. I am the fire that warms and devours. I am the hunger that you have denied, the ache of desire piercing your side. I am the sin you have never confessed, the forbidden hand caressing your breast. You've heard me inside you speak in your dreams, sigh in the ocean, whisper in streams. I am the future you crave and you fear. You know what I bring. Now I am here. I think one of the pleasures of writing drama and things like this is, in a sense, of imagining other characters. Now, two more poems. We talked about ballads today in Professor Ridland's class, and so I thought I would give you a ballad. This is a ballad that begins at a wedding, and it's called Summer Storm. We stood on the rented patio while the party went on inside. You knew the groom from college. I was a friend of the bride. We hugged the brownstone wall behind us to keep our dress clothes dry and watched the sudden summer storm floodlit against the sky. The rain was like a waterfall of brilliant beaded light, cool and silent as the stars the storm hid from the night. To my surprise, you took my arm, a gesture you didn't explain, and we spoke in whispers as if we too might imitate the rain. Then suddenly the storm receded as quickly as it came. The doors behind us opened up. The hostess called your name. I watched you merge into the crowd, aloof and yet polite. We didn't speak another word, except to say goodnight. Why does that evening's memory return with this night's storm? A party 20 years ago, its disappointments warm. There are so many might have beens, what ifs that won't stay buried, other cities, other jobs, strangers we might have married. And memory insists on pining for places it never went, as if life might be happier just by being different. Unsaid. So much of what we live goes on inside. The diaries of grief, the tongue-tied aches of unacknowledged love are no less real for having passed unsaid. What we conceal is always more than what we dare confide. think of the letters that we write our dead. Thank you very much. Did you want me to do questions? Did you want questions or something? Okay, brilliant. Okay. Yeah, I'd be happy to answer a couple of questions. I don't want to, make it drag on too long. But are there any questions? Please.
And you're addressing the question about whether poetry matters. It seemed like you were addressing scholars, academics, and then at the very end you were turning to students and just sort of your average Joe who could get something from poetry. Can you sort of expand on that last section?
Well, if I talk about it in academic terms, because I think that even the average Joe, nowadays, most of their experience of poetry is in school. And so that we tend, now there's something wise about that. I think that from the very beginnings of education, poetry has always been a fundamental part of education. And even today, we use poetry less and less, but there's still this superstition that we can't drop it altogether. And you can make a very strong case of why poetry should be fundamental to early education, because it teaches not just skills of language and skills of speaking and skills of analysis, but also skills of imagination and empathy that come through there. So, but the reason I think I couch it in those terms is that most people's conceptual sense of poetry comes out of their academic background. And so you might as well start where people are, I think. But my feeling as a critic, except in very rare cases I try to follow this, is to never write just for a small professional circle, but to try to write in a way which speaks simultaneously to a specialist and to a generalist, the kind of the interested general reader. And so I really believe in the kind of notion of the public intellectual. I think that that's really important, and we've lost a lot of that in our society. And that if you believe as I do that poetry is indeed extraordinarily important as a kind of way of refining and expanding and articulating our humanity, then I think we need more people who can bridge the gap to the general audience. And so a lot of the work I do is for the BBC, which doesn't pay nearly as well as other things I could do, but I have audiences of 7 million people for the shows I do. And I feel that I can take these people, most of whom are following on a classical music show, and just get them to think about poetry, hear poetry, to make it part of the public conversation, which is culture. So, yes?
What led you from marketing to writing poetry?
Well, it's just the other way around. I am probably the only person in history who went to Stanford Business School to be a poet. I wanted to be a writer. I was in graduate school, and I said, wait a second, I'm not, at Harvard Comp Lit in a PhD program, I am not being trained to be a writer. I'm being trained to be a literary theorist. And for me, that was a great danger because I liked it. I thought it was very interesting. And I realized the longer I was at Harvard, the worse I was becoming as a writer. I was becoming very self-conscious and academic in the way I did these things, and I didn't want to write, for a coterie. And so I had to figure out a way of making a living. And so I'm Mexican Sicilian. From the time I was 9, I had a job. Every shit job you could imagine I have held at one time or another. And so I wanted a profession. So I went to business school, and I made myself a promise, even in business school, that I would spend 3 hours every day before I did any of my schoolwork, I would read or write. And when I was in business, I wrote every night except for Friday, and on the weekends, if I was going to write, I would either write in the evenings or the day, both days. So I would put a 6-day weekend for writing, and for me it was a very good thing because it just simplified my life. I was either at the office or I was at my desk. I had no life. And then about 10 years ago, I really was so well known, I realized I could quit and make a living writing, and so I said, why not? And by then, I'd had a couple of deaths, most obviously the death of my son, but I just realized, how short, life is, and I wanted to do it. So actually, for me, the marketing career was always just a way of paying the bills, and I've always thought of myself primarily as a writer, but being working class. And my parents, who are otherwise good people, neglected to give me the private income I so richly deserve. And I've had to deal with that childhood trauma ever since. I think there's a question over here. Yes, sir.
I think that The reason I say that is because I've heard this story many times of very successful plays in New York that when the written words in the script form was given to the producers, most of the time the play would not sell itself.
Mm-hmm.
The actors would have to get up and actually verbally perform the play.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think right now, I think that there are several traditions going on simultaneously in poetry. The center of poetry, the central tradition of poetry, has, I think, always, with maybe a few decades exception in the 4,000 years of recorded history we have, been as an auditory art, a spoken art. Now, you can go all to one extreme, like performance poetry. I mean, it's interesting. Have you ever heard Robert Burns read by a Scotsman? It's very powerful. Seeing it on the page is kind of minimal. And so there's a kind of poetry that works really best spoken aloud. There's a kind of poetry that works equally well. And then there's a certain kind of poetry which is typographic, like William Carlos Williams, which I think works best on the page. It's a visual typographic prosody. And so, and I occasionally play around with that, but the kind of poetry which interests me most as an artist is that area of free verse which is spoken. And I think of Whitman, Robinson Jeffers being two good examples of that kind of poet. And then the sort of the metrical poetry which is to be heard aloud. But I think that, as an artist, you have to decide what your medium is. Is it your page? Is it the sounds in the air, in a way? And I look on writing I want to write a poem that reads well on the page, but sounds even better spoken aloud. And I think that's what Keats did. I think that's what Shakespeare did. Not that I'm as good as them, but I mean, I think that's always been the kind of primary, mainstream, really, of English language poetry. In some countries like China, their poetry is mainly written to be sung. So you take, it's not just on the page is losing it, but just to read it out loud, it's really to be sung to certain tunes. Yes?
Yeah, I'm glad you read that legacy from your parents' money. And because it's a poem I've used with a group of, I used to work with in a writing class in a prison, and I actually found that poem a very interesting one to use because it had the language that a lot of the people in the class could relate to. But I also used it, just in terms of telling them about using everyday language and that language they were familiar with, but I wondered if you could make some comments about it in relationship to cliché.
Well, the thing is that it's dangerous to use clichés in poems unless you're using them as clichés. You don't want the reader to, so there, since it's all borrowed language, so what the poetry of this is in a sense, the arrangement of the words. I mean, almost every line in that poem, I think, is either from my parents, something they said as a kid, or just something I heard. Megabucks. I don't think my parents ever used, but that was kind of and it's interesting. I've gone to a couple of grammar schools where the classes have composed poems like that. They'll call it a love, and they'll do the same, just point by point, a copy. A friend of mine, who's on a grammar school, sent me one called Sex, where he put all of those things, and so you can it can be kind of a generative model, but I really do think that my own belief is that poetry originates not in writing but in speech. That speech is the matrix of poetry, and that the same way if you cut off high language, you're losing something in your poetry. Same way with cutting off slang and spoken language. And I'm really interested. You ever heard a poet named Marilyn Nelson? She's an African-American poet, and she has this kind of central thing where she's really doing is sort of taking sort of kind of high black diction that you'd hear in a church and sort of low, kind of country dialect, and putting them together as two forces of language in a poem, and just terrific. And you see that a lot of times with groups which have their own language. There's an interesting poem called Bilingual by Rina Espaillat that I'm putting in the next edition of Introduction to Poetry, which is about her father from the Dominican Republic not letting her speak English once she was inside the apartment. And so everything in the poem is it's like there's something in Spanish followed by something in English, which is not quite a translation. And it moves back and forth. And it's a wonderful effect when you can take two levels of language and put them together that way. Or to take something like this, which is the dirtiest subject in American poetry is money. But everybody's interested in it. And so just to take something like that, that's sort of forbidden diction. But anyway, I really believe that poetry comes from speech. Slang is part of speech in the same way that high diction, technical language, things like this are all speech patterns. So I like working in that way. And it's interesting how many imitations. I mean, you get something like that, people can imitate it pretty easily. They could probably write a poem called Jail. And just put jail slang in it, if I was working in a prison. I'll take one more question, then I'll let these poor suffering masses yearning to be free, go. Or is there one more question? Please.
Do you feel that, you were saying you were at Harvard and studying criticism. Do you feel that criticism is diminishing literature and poetry as an art?
I feel very strongly. Well, first of all, I have to say that criticism is extraordinarily important to literature, and that reading certain critics in my life, I've had the kind of frisson and excitement that I would have reading a great novel. And I'm almost always reading, somewhere in my mix of reading, a critical book or critical articles. That being said, I think we're in a very bad patch for academic criticism in the United States today, and probably equally bad in journalistic criticism. The newspaper reviews are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. The academic our essays are getting more and more, pseudo-professional, full of jargon and things like this. And I think that I think we really are suffering from the lack of really great critics right now. So I mean that's what I would say, is that I think that academics are so busy talking to one another that they've forgotten the spiritual and social importance of their own art form, and that diminishes the art. I mean, there's nobody as good as Randall Jarrell, writing right now. Nobody as good as Eliot. Nobody as good as Auden, just as critics. And and the poet, I've always thought of myself as a poet critic, and I take writing criticism very seriously, and I try to make an essay make it interesting writing. Because there's no right. I mean, Helen Wendler seems to think she has a God-given right to bore the reader. So anyway, thank you for putting up with me, and I'll be outside if you want to ask other questions.